Welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about an important concept, which is return. It's a keyword in Python that we are going to see a lot when working with functions. So let's have a look. If let's say, want to create a function called sum, which, by the way, already exists in Python, but we're going to create our own. And I'm going to say num1 for number 1 and num2. Well, our sum function is going to add num1 plus num2. Nice and simple function. Now, if I run sum with number 4 and 5, guess what's about to happen? I'm going to hit run, and nothing happens, which, might not be surprising to you, because we're not printing anything, right? But what if I run print here? Will this change? Let's see. I get none. Is that what you expected? And we've seen none before, right? Remember when we had a list, let's say 1, 2, 3, and then we did something like clear on it? In our editor, it gave us this little arrow and said none. And we talked about this idea of on lists, something like clear changes the actual list and clears everything and empties the list, but it doesn't return a new list. It just modifies the existing list, but instead just returns none to us. Well, functions are just like that. They always have to return something. And when they don't return anything, like there's no return keyword here, it automatically returns none. So if we don't have something like return here, it's always going to return nothing. But if we add return, it's going to say, as soon as we get to line 2, hey, I want you to exit this function. And when you exit this function, I want you to return whatever this expression gives us. If I click run, I get 9. If we change this to 10 plus 5, we get 15. And this is a good general rule with functions, because functions can do two things, right? One, it can return something. So at the end of the function, whatever after the function gets run, we return something, either none or some sort of a value, some sort of a data type. Or we can have a function that doesn't return anything, but perhaps modifies something. So for example, I could print hi, and if I hit run here, I return none because I don't have that return statement. However, my function does something. It modifies, the look of this text, right? It prints hi for us. So a function either modifies something in our program or returns something. And this is a topic that is quite advanced that we'll get into later on when we talk about functional programming. But a good rule of thumb with functions is this. A function should do one thing really well, and usually a function should return something. Now, this doesn't mean that any function that maybe does multiple things or any function that doesn't return something is bad, but it's generally good practice to make your code simple and readable to have these two rules. For example, here, if I have print and addition, this function is doing multiple things. It's worrying about printing, and it's also worrying about summing. And the definition, this function, is called sum. If I didn't know or I didn't see this and all I did was run sum, I think having printing hi would be surprising because the name doesn't really describe what it does. I'm expecting this to be summed. Why is my program saying hi? So we want to make sure that our function does one thing and one thing only really well. Because as we'll see later on, we can combine and run different functions together. And then also, we want to make sure that we return something, because this way, what we can do is we can actually assign this return value to a variable. For example, I can say total equals to sum 10, 5. And because this function returns something, and when it's done running is going to have 15 as a value, that's the same thing as what we're doing here. And here's the cool part. Now I can run maybe sum 10 plus total. Now let's go through this one by one. I define my function. The Python interpreter is going to say, all right, I know what sum is now. You've defined it. I'm going to keep it in memory. It's going to keep going until line 7. And it's going to say, hey, I want a variable total. And I want that total variable to equal sum 10, 5. And before we even assign anything to total, Python interpreter is going to say sum. What's sum again? Oh, I remember. Here, it's in memory. Okay, at sum, I'm going to give it arguments 10 and 5. So it's going to go run that function as soon as we end this closing bracket. It's going to go into the sum. It's going to say, hey, num1 is going to equal 10. Hey, num2 is going to equal 5. Now we go to line 2, and it's going to say, hey, I want you to add 10 plus 5 because I know what these variables are. And then once you're done with that, and this turns into 15, I want you to return. So the Python interpreter, finally, when it's done calling sum, is going to say, hey, assign the value of 15 to the variable total. And then it's going to go to the next line. Hey, I want to print something. What do you want to print? Well, I want to print this. It's going to say, hey, what's sum? I know what sum is. I have it in memory. And then again, it's going to say 10. And then the next argument is going to be total. Hey, what's total? Let me go in memory and find out. Oh, it's 15. So it's like saying 15. And this is the power of functions, right? I'm able to return things and assign them to variables and call them like this. And I can keep running them if I wanted to. If I want to make this even simpler, I can go sum instead of total will be right here. And look at that. Now I have it all in one line. And if I click run, again, it still works. Okay, but what if we do something like this? What if I say define sum, and then I'll say define inside of here another function. And this function takes num1 and num2. And in here, we finally return num1 and num2. Let's test this out. What do you think will happen? Well, first, let's say total equals sum 10 plus 20. And then I'm going to print total. If I click run, I get none. Now, why is that? And this should be obvious to you, because here I'm saying, hey, I want you to define sum. And what are we going to do with the function sum? Well, inside of here, I'm going to define another function. But this return statement is actually not run, right? Because all we're doing inside of this block, this code block, is this part. We're defining the function, but we're never calling another function. So this returns none. And we've lost the ability to, well, to call this function. So how can we solve this? One way is to return, right? So at the end here, we have to make sure that the indentation is right. And we're going to return another func. So let's add return and see what happens here. If I click run, all right, I get this function now. So total is going to equal this function that we returned. And it's in memory. Okay, but I'm not getting the result that I want, right? And why is that? Because, well, we're not calling this function. So there's a few ways that we can do this. We can either give it the parameters or the arguments in here. So let's say 10, 20, and if I click run, I get 30. Or if we want to keep whatever we give it here, I can just simply say another func. So if we give it num1 and num2, and I click run, hey, look at that, I get 30. Now, this video you might have to watch over and over because it does stretch your mind a little bit. And to be honest, this function is not very good because it's very confusing. Your function should be easy to understand. So we might want to change this up a bit. Maybe instead over here of having the same parameter names, just to clarify it, maybe we can say n1 and n2. And then here we do n1 plus n2 to clarify that when we return this other function, I'm using the parameters num1 and num2 that we called here. Because this definition of a function doesn't really care what these things are. It only cares when another function gets called. Now, if you need to pause the video and look at this and maybe practice this a little bit, that's completely understandable. But I wanted to show you the power of return. You can have nested functions, just like you could with conditionals. But you have to be careful that your function either returns something, otherwise it's going to return none. And most of the time, you're going to want to return something from a function. So we can do something like this where we assign it to a variable so we can use it later on in our programs. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. One last thing. A return keyword automatically exits the function. So that in here, if I added another piece of code like print hello, or maybe even have return 5 in here, you see that it's still valid. But if I run this, I still get 30 because the interpreter never gets to line 5 and 6. Because as soon as we return something from a function, it exits that function. And the reason that this part doesn't exit the function is because, remember, inside of this function, we're defining. So we're not actually running this part. We're just saying, hey, when we see another function coming up in our code, we know what it is. But we're not going to run it. So it's going to look like this. And as soon as it sees the return statement, when it gets called, it's going to say, all right, I'm exiting out of this function with this value. Just a little heads up.